Hello and welcome to episode 17 of The Actual Magician. Yes, I am an actual magician's bookshelf, where today we're going to be taking a look at the Waite-Trinick Tarot. Now, this is not a tarot deck, it is a set of tarot images that A. Waite produced 10 years after he'd produced what he called his little experiment with Pamela Colman Smith. So 10 years later, he produced a second set of tarot images when he was aged 60. This was in 1917 to 1925, and he did it in collaboration with a stained glass artist called J.B. Trinick, who lived between 1890 and 1974. And he was a lot younger. He was age 27 in 1917 when he worked with Waite for 5 years on this tarot set of images. The image that you're looking at is the High Priestess, and you'll see that it is virtually an illustration of what we would now call a drawing down of the moon. And this was obviously before Gerald Gardner and witchcraft took on the idea of drawing down the moon as an invocation of the goddess. In 1917, Waite had just finished his incredible book, The Way of Divine Union, and it was slightly before the Lamps of Western Mysticism in 1923. The genesis of this deck was just shortly after the First World War, and Trinick had actually been returned to England. He was originally born in Australia. So J.B. Trinick was a member of the Fellowship of the Rosy Cross, the occult, mystical, spiritual order that A. Waite had founded after he'd left the Golden Dawn. He'd given the Golden Dawn a couple of tries at least, but was disenchanted, I guess, with their material and wanted to work in a more mystical manner. And his rituals in the F.R.C. that we have records of are far more elaborate, they're far more wordy, they're far more, dare I say, religious, spiritual than the purely magical, symbolic rituals of the Golden Dawn. Waite obviously wanted to produce a set of images for work in the temple, and we know that these were used in the temple because, as we have seen in the Golden Dawn, they used the tarot images not as cards per se, but as tracing boards, Masonic tracing boards, to teach the symbolism of the ritual. Waite saw the tarot as the symbols, or the great symbols, of the hidden paths. And this is what his album was called, in which J.B. Trinick's original artwork can be found in the vault of the British Museum. We have covered all of this in a lot of detail with the first publication of all of the images, both from the British Museum and in my private collection in Abiding in the Sanctuary, which was published in 2011. With a preface by Mary K. Greer. I'd like to read something that A. Waite said in Shadows of Life and Thought. This is on page 194, where he said, about the tarot, there is an explanation of the trumps major, which, belonging to the highest order of spiritual truth, is not occult, but mystical. It is not a public communication, but abides in its own sanctuary. And Mary K. Greer did actually suggest that Waite had prophesied that his hidden symbols would be hidden for a century. In Lamps of Western Mysticism, he wrote on page 119, grace, which abides in symbolism, may become like sleeping beauty, be unawakened for 100 years, but it is there under its proper veils, and ever will the prince of the priesthood, when he comes to his due day, be able to restore it. It is in fullness by the touch of the clean hand, by the sound of the living voice, and the kiss of worship. And so this set of images was hidden for 100 years. We tell the full story of the discovery of this deck, which was first teased to the public by a book by Decker, Dumas and de Paulis, but that only had a few poor reproductions of some of the images that had been circulating amongst 2 or 3 private collectors at that time. And in our book, Abiding in the Sanctuary, we do show all of the images and their relationship to the Tree of Life, which is different to the Golden Dawn attributions. Strangely enough, J.B. Trinick came to live in Cumbria, where both Tali Goodwin and I live, and his place in Milnthorpe actually looked over a church with a stained glass window. So it's nice to think that he spent his final days perhaps sitting looking out of his front window at a beautiful stained glass image in a church to which he'd also dedicated his artwork and life. So we know that A.E. Waite conceived of these images as tracing boards, as illustrations of the symbols of the great paths. And J.B. Trinick also wrote a very strange book on alchemy, and he corresponded with Jung about alchemy, and Jung provided an introduction to Trinick's book on alchemy called The Fire-Tried Stone. But in that book there's an interesting reference to the revelation of symbolism, and I can't help but think this is Trinick talking about how the images would have been revealed at key points in a ritual for mystical revelation. He writes of the sense of symbols as being approached with a sense of revelation and numinosity, and he says that this is indispensable to the proper approach towards an essentially spiritual secret that's maintained within the symbols. And he goes on to describe, after the long discipline and careful preparation of a gradual initiatory journey, the adiatum is reached, a curtain is parted, we are allowed to contemplate, never to handle, that which lies within, and the curtain is redrawn, leaving us revivified and exalted, each in his own way, in full inward possession, each according to his own capacity, of that subtle essence of itself which a mystery alone can impart, but only in so far as it is allowed to remain a mystery. And I'm sure that that is a reference to the revelation beyond the veil of symbolism within an F.R.C. ritual. Trinick also echoes the attitude taken by Waite 50 years earlier, and when Trinick talks about the problems of sacramentalism in symbols, and this is an important thing to consider how Waite saw tarot as well. He saw it as a sacrament, as symbolic of the divine. Trinick critiqued a increasing inadequacy of a symbol to convey its mystery, particularly when it becomes, as he put it, oversaturated with meaning, with symbolic layers, with interpretive images all layered within one image. And we can see in his tarot with Waite how simple, or apparently simple, the images actually are in terms of the number of symbolic components in them. And Trinick had suggested a desire for a form of what he called a arcane discipline, or disciplina arcanae, which consisted of 3 alternative courses with regards to symbolism. Either you abandon a symbol, you simply use it before it becomes inappropriate, or a third course, which he said that the symbol itself should be taken in hand and subjected to a process of refinement and refashioning designed to increase the measures of its applicability at increasing altitudes. And those increasing altitudes are of spiritual ascent. So he was talking about refining the simplicity of a symbol until it conveys the immediacy of spiritual experience with no further conversation, interpretation, contemplation. And we see in the Waite-Trinick Tarot the immediacy of these symbols, unlike Waite had conveyed with Pamela Colman Smith some 10 years earlier. Trinick's magical motto in the F.R.C. was Donec Attingum. This comes from a book by Franz Hartmann, published in 1890, called In the Pronaos of the Temple of Wisdom, Rosicrucians and Hermetic Philosophy, where Hartmann gives a list of so-called Rosicrucian emblems, and at number 30 of these emblems is described as love shooting arrows at a heart with the inscription Donec Attingham. Now, this list is actually taken from an earlier book from 1731, and they're not necessarily Rosicrucian emblems, but they were given this by assertion by Hartmann himself. And that particular emblem illustrates the story of Martha and Mary, and specifically quotes Luke 10:42, Porro unum est necessarium, which means but only one thing is needed. Sometimes it's translated as but few things are needed, or indeed only one. And the Latin inscription for the emblem itself translates best as until we touch, or until we come into contact, which in relation to the image and similar names in the F.R.C, such as vocatus, showing the divine longing, it's basically J.B. Trinick taking on the name of until we touch, until I reach my aspired goal. And it's a statement of faith that that goal will come about. So we know that there are different versions of each of the images. There are black and white and painted versions of these images. They were likely shown in the F.R.C and still are as either the black and white plates or the full colour images. There is also one image which is actually, one could perhaps consider it as the Emperor or the Hierophant, but it is actually Darth, or Darth, which means knowledge, and it's on the Tree of Life. It is a non-Sephiroth on the Tree of Life itself. And it's possible that Waite and Trinick intended to do 32 images, including not only the 22 paths and their tarot corresponding images, but also the Sephiroth, and to illustrate those. And we can see how this might have looked by the image of Darth that still exists. And we can see in this image that there is a state of ichud or unification, and this is born by the word unitas on the crown of the figure and the New Jerusalem that is pictured behind it. So there is a ultimate realization of the living sacrament within this image, and it illustrates the mystical sense of unification that Waite saw as central to the mystical quest. His concept of unitas is something that occurs throughout all of his spiritual, mystical and magical working. It's unfortunate that the First World War, that Trinick having to move at that time in his life to find work elsewhere, possibly interrupted the completion of the Sephirothic images of this tarot. In terms of the correspondences and attributions to the positions of the Tree of Life, then without going into a lot of detail, one of the important things is that Darth actually splits the paths on the Tree of Life compared to the Golden Dawn version of the tree diagram itself. And to Waite, the ultimate symbol, which is alluded to in Pictorial Key to the Tarot 10 years earlier with his work with Pamela Colman Smith, is actually the wheel symbol. And to Waite, the wheel is uppermost on the Tree of Life because it symbolizes the central hub of divinity and the unification of everything. It's a illustration, I guess, of the saying that God is a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. And this unbound wheel that unifies all things and is held by an angelic force is seen by Waite as being at the top of the Tree of Life. A major difference that we see in the Waite-Trinick Tarot is in the Hanged Man, and it is alluded to in the Golden Dawn and there are similarities between some of the Golden Dawn teachings for the inner order that don't make it out into the Waite-Smith Tarot that are then found within the Waite-Trinick Tarot images. And with the Hangman, we see the concept of the drowned giant, the idea of divinity being within matter, and it's a central symbol and a central concept of mystical teaching that the divine, in effect, permeates matter, that is ever present in the material world, that there is really only an illusionary difference between the spiritual and material temporal world. As Timaeus has it, time is a moving likeness of eternity, that the physical world, the temporal world, is our illusionary version of actual reality that we are present in at all times, because how else could it be otherwise? And so the Hanged Man is the reversal of our usual state, where we believe that the spiritual world is somewhere out there and we're living in a material world and we're experiencing that world. The Hanged Man is when we are bound to the upper world and removed one by one from the lower world, from the material world, from the false attachment to self identity and external experience. That the unification comes when we recognize the drowned giant in all things, and this is under the rainbow of Kesheth, as we see in the illustration. Also, very usefully in the Waite-Trinick Tarot, even though it's been hidden for 100 years, we can now go back and look at the Waite-Smith Tarot and see for sure of some of the things that Waite was perhaps intimating at, and we can only make a best guess. Now we actually know, because there is text accompanying the great symbols of the paths that we allude to in our book, Abiding in the Sanctuary, and within that text it makes it very clear that the Waite-Trinick deck is a Christian mystical deck. It's why on the title of the book, Abiding in the Sanctuary, we talk about the tagline is the Waite-Trinick Tarot, a Christian mystical tarot, 1917 to 1923. And we can see very clearly when we look at the sun figure that it has the initiate and Christ very, very clearly defined. And when we place these cards with the Lucifer figure, which is the devil figure, onto the Tree of Life in the Waite-Trinick model, we can literally see that the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, are all placed around Tifereth in the centre of the Tree of Life, which is the perfect centre of the soul, which is the perfect garden, which is our redeemed soul on the journey back up the Tree of Life, and where we fall from in our fall from grace, from the pure consciousness and pure awareness into the world of separation, illusionary separation, attachment, mundanity, and material life. So the Lucifer figure, the Christ figure, the lover's figure, all of those are a very clear depiction of the Garden of Eden on the centre of the Tree of Life. And in fact, it is in Temperance that we have a very clear depiction of what is only again alluded to in the Waite-Smith Tarot, where on Temperance we have the Yod-He Vav-He and the glowing mountain in the distance, which is the divine crown, Kether, the mountain of initiation, and the unity of the four lower Sephiroth within the angelic presence that is on the Temperance card. But here in the Waite-Trinick Tarot, we can see how clearly that it's actually been labelled with Yesod, with Malkuth, and the angel is pouring the two streams from Geborah and Hesed, and the ritual in which one would see this image and have it revealed to one includes text to that intent, that it is the blessing of Hesed and the rigour and might and victory of Geborah that is being poured in through the soul once one attains to this particular state, and then that is poured forth into Malkuth. And the shell in this card alludes to the Klipoth or the Kelipot, depending on how one pronounces it, which are seen as the shells or waste of the divine light as it breaks down through the Tree of Life. There are many other mysteries that are revealed within the Waite-Trinick Tarot. For example, that the moon is a reflection of the sun, and then that we go back to Waite's writing in the Waite-Smith Tarot and with the pictorial key to the tarot, where now it's made more clear that he sees the moon as a symbol of the reflective mind, not the spiritual thinking mind, but merely the rational mind, that the mind can only reflect and give form to things that are felt, intuited, a part of the spiritual experience. And whilst the mind can raise itself up, it can only go so far. And he actually refers to that in Pictorial Key, where he talks about the chariot, also a symbol of the ascended mind, the mind taken by mystical contemplation to higher realms in the Kabbalistic Merkava mysticism, where one rises as if carried by a chariot to mystical contemplation and mystical vision, that the chariot can only get so far, that the chariot would be able to approach the high priestess, and he literally states this in Pictorial Key, but the priestess would not be able to give him an answer. And because the high priestess in the symbolism is the Shekinah, is the divine presence, and that can be experienced, it can be intuited, it can be part of one's spiritual vision and experience, but it is not something that can be reduced to thought, or to which logic, rationality and the thought process can take it. And again, all of this is made very clear as these are symbols of the paths themselves, and they are for teaching the mystical path, the mystical visions, and the lessons of each stage of the initiate up the Tree of Life through, in this case, the order of the F.R.C, or the Fellowship of the F.R.C. So the book Abiding in the Sanctuary has a lot more about Trinick. It has a lot more about Pippet, one of the other artists that had a go at one of the images, because Waite wasn't necessarily happy with the way Trinick had designed that particular image, so Pippet had a go at one of them. And we can see in the book as well all of the different versions of the images, both from my private collection, and I tell the story about how that came to me by, again, a strange coincidence, and how Tali Goodwin found the images in the British Museum, and the story of how all of that came together to reveal these images after 100 years. And we would never produce a deck of these images because we don't believe that that was their purpose. And whilst I have done readings with a personalized set of the images, I would certainly not think to necessarily do that again, because these images are far more transcendent. They are far more designed for mystical contemplation, particularly in the Western Esoteric Initiatory system that I teach, for which I have the Crucible Club and our private members group, the Order of Everlasting Day. And I'll put a link in the comments, those who might be interested in joining us in that mystical, spiritual, magical, initiatory quest that Waite was so passionate about sharing, illustrating, and providing us a path in that mystical life. So as ever, the worker is hidden in the workshop, and I look forward to seeing you in a future video. Thank you.